Stop scrolling. I need you to look at something. This is a map, a real map, published by professional European cartographers, used by governments, explorers, and navigators. And right there, taking up nearly half the known world, is a name. Tartaria. Now I want you to look at this second map. Same region, same tradition of European cartography, published just 150 years later. That name is completely gone. Not renamed, not divided into smaller pieces with explanatory notes, not gradually faded out. Gone, wiped, as if it never existed. And the question that your history teacher never asked, that your university textbook never raised, that the mainstream documentary you watched last month carefully avoided, is this. How do you make the largest named empire on Earth disappear from the historical record? And more importantly, why? Let me take you back to the year 1710. If you are a European scholar, a naval officer, a merchant planning a trade route, or a nobleman with an educated interest in world geography, and you open your atlas, you will see Tartaria. Not as a footnote, not as an asterisk, as the dominant feature of the entire Asian continent. The maps of this era, and we are talking about maps produced by the finest cartographic houses in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Britain, show Tartaria as a multi-regional empire stretching from the eastern edge of Europe, across the Ural Mountains, across the vast Siberian plateau, through Central Asia, and down toward the northern borders of China and Persia. The cartographers are not vague about it, they divide it, they label its internal regions. You have Tartaria Europea, sitting east of Poland and the Russian principalities. You have Tartaria Asiatica, the enormous central mass spanning what we now call Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and deeper into Siberia. You have Chinese Tartaria, a distinct region bordering the Chinese Empire to the north. You have independent Tartaria, explicitly labeled to distinguish it from zones under outside influence. These are not explorers guessing at blank spaces on a map. These are professional cartographers dividing a known territory into administrative and geographic subregions. In 1672, the French geographer Pierre Duval publishes a world map where Tartaria occupies more area than all of Europe. In 1720, Johann Baptist Homann, regarded as one of the most authoritative cartographers in European history, publishes his world atlas. Tartaria is enormous, central, and labeled with confidence. The same year, the British publish comparable atlases showing the same configuration. For roughly 200 years, from 1500 through to the mid-1700s, if you were an educated European and someone asked you what the largest territorial entity on the map was, you would say Tartaria without hesitation. That is the starting point. Now I want to show you where it ends. Mainstream historians do have an explanation for Tartaria. And I want to give it to you fairly, because you deserve to hear both sides before you decide what you believe. The official position is this. Tartaria was never a real empire. It was a catch-all geographic label, a convenient European term used to group together the various Turkic, Mongol, and nomadic peoples living east of the Urals. As European knowledge of Central Asia improved, as the Russian Empire pushed eastward and documented what it found, the vague label was replaced with more precise, more accurate regional names. Nothing was erased, knowledge simply improved. That is the official answer. Here is why it does not hold up. Problem 1 is what I call the detail problem. If Tartaria was a label for ignorance, a placeholder slapped on regions Europeans did not truly understand, then the maps from 1500 to 1750 should show it becoming progressively vaguer as knowledge improved. But that is not what they show. The maps from 1650 onward show Tartaria becoming more detailed, not less. More city names appear, internal subregional borders become more defined, named routes appear cutting through it, population zones are distinguished from one another. As European cartography gets more sophisticated, the depiction of Tartaria gets more organized, not more uncertain. If this was simply ignorance being corrected, the detail should dissolve. Instead, it sharpens, right up until the moment it vanishes entirely. Problem 2 is the speed problem. The official narrative implies a gradual scholarly correction unfolding over decades. But look at what actually happens on the maps. In 1710, Tartaria is massive, dominant, and unquestioned. In 1730, it is still there. In 1750, still present. By 1820, gone, completely, replaced with different labels, different political structures, different names. That is not gradual correction, that is replacement, and it happens in a historically narrow window that lines up precisely with the expansion of Russian imperial power across Central Asia. Problem 3 is what historians call the witness problem. European travelers who moved through Central Asia during the 1700s left written accounts, journals, diplomatic dispatches, merchant records. Some of these accounts describe things that should not exist according to the official version of what was there. Organized settlements, agricultural infrastructure, architectural structures that imply permanent habitation and civic organization. These are not the journals of men crossing empty steppe and nomadic campsites. When you try to match these accounts to the official historical record of what was supposedly in those locations during that period, the names do not correspond, the settlements do not appear in the records, the population densities implied by certain accounts do not match the official archaeological timeline. It is as though the written record and the cartographic record and the physical account cannot all be true simultaneously. And when three independent sources create that kind of contradiction, that is when historians are supposed to dig deeper. Most have not. I want you to look at the two maps now with fresh eyes, because this is the visual argument, and it is the one that no official explanation has ever fully resolved. On the left, a European atlas, approximately 1710. The map is professionally produced. It is the academic standard of its day. It shows Tartaria as a vast, clearly bounded, internally subdivided empire. The name sits across the map in bold lettering. The subregions are named. The borders, while not as sharp as a modern political map, are consistent with how every other empire of the era is depicted. Compare how Europe is drawn on the same map. Individual city names, mountain ranges, coastlines with high precision, river systems mapped accurately. Now compare the level of confidence applied to Tartaria. The cartographer is not hesitant. He is not saying here be dragons. He is saying here is a specific political and geographic reality, and here are its component parts. Now look at the map on the right, the atlas from approximately 1850. Same region of the world, same European cartographic tradition, comparable level of geographic expertise. Tartaria is gone. In its place, you now have three distinct things. First, the Russian Empire, occupying the northern and central portions of what was previously the core of Tartaria. Second, a scattering of fragmented Central Asian territories, khanates, unnamed zones, proto-colonial designations, filling the southern portions. Third, Siberia, labeled not as a political entity, not as a nation or empire or civilization, but simply as a landscape, a geographic designation, a place with weather and trees and rivers, but apparently no meaningful human history worth naming. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because here is the historical pattern that makes this significant. When one empire defeats another, when Rome conquered Carthage, when the Ottomans took Constantinople, when the Mongols swept through the Islamic caliphates of the Middle East, the defeated civilization still leaves a trace in the record. We know Carthage existed because even Rome, which burned it to the ground and salted the earth, acknowledged what it had destroyed. The defeated culture leaves ruins. It leaves coins. It leaves cultural memory in the populations that survived it. It leaves a before and after in the historical narrative. Conquered peoples are still recorded. So where is the trace of Tartaria? The official answer, again, is that there is no trace because there was nothing unified to leave a trace. But that answer requires you to accept that the most consistently and confidently labeled entity on 200 years of world maps was, essentially, a collective hallucination of European cartographers. And it requires you to accept that the correction of that hallucination happened to coincide exactly with Russian imperial expansion into precisely those territories. That is a significant coincidence to accept uncritically. Let me walk you through how historical erasure actually works, because most people imagine it requires a dramatic, coordinated conspiracy, a secret meeting, a bonfire of documents, men in dark rooms destroying evidence. That is not how it works. Real historical erasure is administrative, it is bureaucratic, it is quiet, and it is almost always done in the name of modernization, correction, or progress. Here is the mechanism in its simplest form. Step 1. You control the institutions that produce the official record: the universities, the Royal Cartographic Societies, the academic journals, the official archives. Step 2. New maps are produced under your institutional authority. These maps use your preferred nomenclature. The previous nomenclature is not explicitly declared wrong, it simply stops being used. Step 3. The old maps are not destroyed. They sit in archives, but they are no longer cited, no longer reprinted, no longer included in the educational curriculum. They become curiosities for specialists rather than reference documents for the educated public. Step 4. Within 2 or 3 academic generations, roughly 60 to 90 years, the old nomenclature is no longer in living memory for the mainstream. Scholars who study it are regarded as working in a niche corner of historical cartography. Their findings do not disturb the mainstream narrative because the mainstream narrative does not engage with them. Step 5. Anyone who raises the discrepancy is not suppressed. Suppression creates martyrs and draws attention. Instead, they are categorized. Their work is filed under conspiracy theory, or fringe history, or amateur revisionism. The categorization does the work of suppression without the drama. This is not a theory about how Tartaria was erased. This is a documented description of how institutional knowledge management works in every field where uncomfortable data accumulates. It happened with the academic discussion of the Bronze Age collapse. It happened with debates around pre-Columbian contact between civilizations. It happens consistently when the official timeline of human development is threatened by inconvenient evidence. The mechanism is always the same. Now apply it to Tartaria. You have a region of the world undergoing rapid political reorganization throughout the 1700s and 1800s. The Russian Empire is expanding. Central Asian peoples are being brought under colonial administration. Local histories are being recorded, but recorded by the conquering power in the conquering power's language and filed in the conquering power's archives. The name Tartaria carried political implications. It implied a prior unified identity, a prior sovereignty, a prior legitimacy that predated Russian presence. Replacing that name with fragmented, localized, tribal designations did something very specific. It transformed a single story into 100 smaller stories. And 100 smaller stories are much easier to manage than one large one. There is a growing body of independent researchers who have spent years in archives pulling original maps, cross-referencing primary sources, and attempting to reconstruct what the historical record of Central Asia actually shows before the mid-1800s reorganization. I want to share some of what they have found, not as proof of any single theory, but as a collection of data points that the official narrative has not satisfactorily explained. Finding 1. The architectural anomaly. Across Central Asia and Siberia, there are architectural structures that existing official narratives struggle to date and attribute correctly. Some of these structures show design characteristics inconsistent with the nomadic cultures they are officially attributed to: large stone foundations, drainage systems, structural complexity implying both permanence and engineering knowledge. When researchers ask who built these and when, the official answers tend to be vague: unknown peoples, prehistoric origins, possibly imported techniques. What they do not say is, these might be remnants of a large, organized civilization that operated in this region during the period when European maps showed Tartaria here. Finding 2. The population gap. Demographic historians studying Central Asian population records from the 18th and 19th centuries have noted something unusual. The population figures implied by Russian imperial census records in the mid-1800s, the first systematic counts of the region, are lower than what contemporary travelers' accounts and agricultural productivity estimates from the same region would suggest should be there. Where did the people go? The official explanation involves disease, conflict, and displacement during the period of Russian expansion. That is a possible explanation, but it is not the only one, and the scale of the discrepancy in some analyses is large enough that it deserves more scrutiny than it currently receives. Finding 3. The linguistic residue. Language is extraordinarily difficult to erase. Across the region that the old maps labeled Tartaria, linguists have documented loan words, place name etymologies, and structural grammatical similarities between geographically separated language groups that suggest a period of contact, or shared culture, that the official fragmented tribal narrative does not explain. Languages that should have nothing in common show traces of something shared. Finding 4. The cartographic confidence. I keep returning to this because it is the most visually obvious piece of evidence. Look at how European cartographers depicted regions they genuinely did not understand. Look at how they drew sub-Saharan Africa in 1500. Look at the interior of Australia before British settlement. Look at the blank expanses labelled terra incognita, here be dragons, or simply left empty. That is what genuine cartographic ignorance looks like on a map. Now look at how they drew Tartaria. There are no dragons, there are no blanks. There are named cities, named roads, named subregions, named political distinctions. These men were drawing what they believed was real. I want to step back from the evidence for a moment and ask you something more fundamental. Why does this matter? If Tartaria was a real civilization that was erased from the record, so what? History is full of erased civilizations. Empires rise and fall, names change, records are lost. Why does Tartaria specifically deserve your attention? Here is why. The scale. We are not talking about a small city-state. We are not talking about a regional culture. The maps, remember the maps, show Tartaria as the largest named entity on Earth during a period stretching across 2 centuries of European cartography. If something that large was genuinely erased from the mainstream historical narrative, then the mainstream historical narrative has a gap in it, the size of a continent. And gaps that large do not exist by accident. They exist because someone made a series of decisions, institutional decisions, editorial decisions, archival decisions, about what to include and what to leave out. Every history book you were given in school was produced by an institution. That institution had funding. That funding came from somewhere. And the somewhere that funding comes from has interests. This does not require a dark conspiracy. It only requires the ordinary, mundane operation of institutional self-interest, applied consistently across time. When you realize that the historical record you were given is a curated selection, not a complete picture, it changes how you read everything else. The question is not whether Tartaria was the greatest empire in history, or just a cartographic miscategorization. The question is why the official record is so uninterested in resolving that ambiguity. Come back to the maps one more time. Look at the left map, 1710, and look specifically at the border lines. Borders on historical maps tell you something important. Cartographers drew definitive borders around things they understood as politically distinct. Vague or approximate borders, dotted lines, gradual fade-outs, those are how they depicted uncertain zones. The borders around Tartaria on the 1710 maps are not dotted. They are not faded. They are drawn with the same confidence as the borders around the Russian principalities, around the Ottoman Empire, around Persia and China. This is not the cartographic language of uncertainty. Now look at the right map, 1850. The Russian Empire's borders are crisp and definitive. The newly designated Central Asian territories have borders. Even the geographic region labeled Siberia has limits drawn around it. But here is what is missing from the right map. There is no note that says, this region was previously labeled Tartaria. There is no cartographic acknowledgement that the labeling changed. There is no historiographic footnote saying, for 2 centuries, European scholars called this Tartaria, here is why we now call it something different. It just changes, without explanation, without transition, without academic record of the moment of revision. In any modern scholarly context, a revision of that magnitude would require documentation. A named entity covering half a continent, present in the authoritative cartographic record for over 200 years, simply stops being named. With no explanation in the record. That is what the maps show. Not a theory, not an interpretation. The maps themselves show you a before and an after with nothing in between. Section 8, what to do with this, 25:30 to 27:30. So where does this leave you? I am not going to tell you what to believe. That is not the purpose of this video. What I am going to tell you is this. The maps exist, you can look at them yourself. The major national libraries of Europe, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the British Library, the Herzogin Anna Amalia Bibliothek in Germany, have digitized significant portions of their historical cartographic collections. You can go online and pull up maps from 1650, 1720, 1780, and 1850, and do this comparison yourself. The primary sources are accessible. What I want you to take from this video is the habit of asking a specific kind of question. Not just what does the record say, but who produced the record, when, and what was happening politically at the moment of production. Every map is a political document. Every atlas reflects the institutional priorities of its age. Every omission is a choice. When you look at a world map today and you see the borders drawn as they currently stand, ask yourself what those borders replaced. Ask yourself what name used to sit on that territory. Ask yourself where the people went who lived there before the current name was assigned. Because somewhere in the gap between the old name and the new one is a story that somebody decided not to tell. Tartaria is one of those stories. And whether you believe it was a civilization, an empire, a geographic label, or something else entirely, the maps tell you clearly, definitively, that something was there. Something was there, it had a name, it was considered real by the best cartographic minds of its era for 200 years. And then one day, it was not. If this video made you think differently about the maps you were shown in school, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this kind of research reach people who would never otherwise encounter it. If you want to go deeper, there is a companion video linked in the description where we go into the specific atlases, pull the original sources, and look at the decade-by-decade cartographic record in much closer detail. And drop a comment below with one word. Just one word. The word is erased. If you made it to the end of this video, and that one word describes how this information made you feel, drop it in the comments. No explanation needed, just that word. Because sometimes that is all the evidence needs. I will see you in the next one.